Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. In the thick twilight of Petrograd, as the cold mist from the Neva seeped through fragments of old posters and the empty sockets of broken windows, a man in a long greatcoat walked quickly along the embankment. His step was firm, military, yet his movements betrayed a strange, almost sickly caution. On his cap, a dull red star gleamed, a symbol of a new era that promised to erase the past and build a world on the foundation of justice. However, those who met him in the corridors of the Smolny knew him not merely as a military specialist devoted to the revolution, but as Ivan Dubovoy, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with one of the most resounding upheavals within the nascent system of Soviet power. On that evening of 1918, no one could have imagined that beneath the cloth of that red greatcoat lay not just the heart of an old career officer, but a complex mechanism of a double game, capable of toppling the fragile balance in a city gripped by panic. This period in Russian history resembled a boiling cauldron, where old ideals were being remelted into something terrifying and incomprehensible. The city lived in a state of constant anticipation of catastrophe. Bread rationing, queues, rumors of advancing German troops, and whispers of secret conspiracies brewing in basements and attics. Petrograd had transformed into a backdrop for a grand tragedy, where every passerby could turn out to be either a victim or a judge. The Bolsheviks, who had seized power a few months prior, desperately needed professionals. The army was falling apart. Old generals had either fled south or gone into hiding, awaiting the end of this madness. It was at this moment that people like Ivan Dubovoy, those whom the new government called military specialists, entered the historical stage. They were met with suspicion. Commissars kept an eye on them, but without their knowledge in fortification, logistics, and tactics, the young republic was doomed to a swift end. The presence of former Tsarist officers in the ranks of the Red Army was a forced measure, a paradox that corroded the system from within. On one hand, there was a fanatical devotion to the idea of world revolution. On the other, the cold professionalism of men who had sworn allegiance to the emperor. This coexistence was like trying to mix fire and water. Ivan Dubovoy, with an impeccable reputation in military circles and profound knowledge, seemed an ideal acquisition for the new government. His transition to the side of the Reds was staged with appropriate grandeur, public declarations, readiness to share hardships with the proletariat, active work in staff headquarters. He became one of those figures on whom Leon Trotsky relied, asserting that discipline and experience were more important than class origin in matters of state defense. But it was behind this facade of loyalty that the first thread of that tangled knot lay hidden, which would lead to a shocking finale. The external conflict unfolded against the backdrop of a catastrophic situation on the fronts and within Petrograd itself. The Extraordinary Commission, led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, was just beginning to gain momentum, transforming into a formidable instrument of suppression and control. The Petrograd Cheka, under the leadership of Moisei Uritsky, worked at maximum tension. Reports of impending uprisings arrived daily. Dissatisfaction brewed in the Red Army headquarters. Many genuinely did not understand how yesterday's class enemies could be entrusted with keys to arsenals and plans for strategic operations. A premonition of betrayal hung in the air. Every defeat at the front, every blown-up warehouse was blamed on sabotage by the former ones. Ivan Dubovoy found himself at the very center of this political storm. His work required access to secret information, to plans for troop movements, and the location of defensive lines. This was a position of colossal responsibility and equally colossal danger. Events began to take a frightening turn when rumors spread throughout the city about the existence of a powerful underground organization uniting officers who had not reconciled with the new regime. These people, formerly serving in Soviet institutions, were allegedly preparing a large-scale rebellion aimed at seizing strategic objects and overthrowing Bolshevik power in the cradle of the revolution. Outwardly, everything looked like ordinary paranoia, characteristic of any revolutionary time. But the number of circumstantial evidences grew. Important documents began to disappear, orders were executed with delays, and in private conversations, officers increasingly made statements bordering on treason. Ivan Dubovoy, being in good standing with the leadership, paradoxically remained beyond suspicion in the initial stage of the investigation. He was considered that very honest specialist who, by his example, proved the possibility of cooperation. However, it was this trust that became the key that opened the doors for the implementation of one of the most audacious plans of that time. Dubovoy's internal conflict was much deeper than just a political choice. Imagine a man raised in traditions of honor, duty to the fatherland, and loyalty to an oath, who suddenly finds himself in a world where all these concepts are declared remnants of the past. For an officer of his level, transitioning to the Bolsheviks could not be a simple act of survival. It was either a deep internal transformation or a carefully planned disguise. Dubovoy understood that every step he took, every order he signed, was a dance on the razor's edge. His personal drama lay in the necessity of daily lying, looking into the eyes of people whom he considered the destroyers of his homeland. His motivation was not mercenary. He did not seek wealth or ranks, which he already had enough of in his past life. He was driven by the idea of saving what could still be saved, even if it required him to wear the mask of a traitor in the eyes of his former comrades, and the mask of a supporter in the eyes of the new masters. This duality created incredible psychological pressure. Those around him noticed his reclusiveness, which they attributed to the harshness of military life. But inside him, a constant dialogue was taking place. Does one person have the right to assume the role of judge and arbiter of destinies on the scale of an entire city? Dubovoy's ambitions were directed not at personal glory, but at implementing a large-scale plan which, he believed, would return Russia to the path of legality. His fear was not fear for his life, but apprehension that the slightest mistake would disrupt the preparations in which hundreds of people were involved. He felt like an architect in a building that was about to collapse, and his task was to build a secret exit within that building for those who were ready to fight. The philosophical level of this confrontation concerned the very essence of power and trust. The clash of value systems was absolute. On one side was faith in the collective mind of the proletariat and the necessity of terror for a bright future. On the other, individual responsibility and traditional state institutions. Dubovoy embodied a paradox, using the tools of revolution to undermine it. It was an intellectual duel between the old school of governance and the new spontaneous force. The question was acute. Can a system built on suspicion function effectively, relying on those it hates? And conversely, can a person maintain their identity while completely mimicking a hostile environment? This situation exposed the deepest contradictions of the era, where betrayal could be interpreted as the highest act of loyalty, and loyalty as madness. The denouement came suddenly, when in the spring of 1918, the Cheka gained access to the archives of one of the clandestine groups. It turned out that Ivan Dubovoy's defection to the Reds was not a result of enlightenment. It was a strategic operation sanctioned by an underground center. He didn't just serve, he built a parallel command structure within the Red Army headquarters. His signature was on documents that directed resources to units where commanders were secretly connected with the White movement. He created windows in the city's defense, through which opposition forces were to enter at a decisive moment. Petrograd shuddered at the scale of the revealed truth. The man entrusted with planning the defense of the cradle of the revolution had been working all this time to dismantle it. This was a gut punch to the entire system of commissars and personally to the leaders of the military department. The moment of transformation occurred in the offices of Gorokovaya, too, where the Cheka administration was located. The investigation was conducted with unprecedented speed and severity. Dubovoy, confronted with irrefutable evidence, correspondence, plans, testimonies from his own contacts, did not deny anything. His behavior during interrogations struck the investigators with its icy composure. He spoke of his duty to Russia, of his actions being the only available way to fight what he considered chaos and lawlessness. His revelations confirmed the Chekists' worst fears. Every officer, every intellectual, every former was now perceived as a potential Dubovoy. This discovery radically changed the authorities' policy towards military specialists, turning moderate caution into total paranoia. The unmasking of Ivan Dubovoy became a catalyst for a process that would later be called _3_. If previously officers' transgressions might have been overlooked, attributed to incompetence, after this incident, any mistake began to be interpreted as deliberate sabotage. Dubovoy's fate was sealed within hours. For the Bolsheviks, he became an ideal example of why the old world could not be trusted. His figure was used to justify the need to introduce the institution of political commissars with expanded powers, who had the right to overturn any orders from commanders. Thus, his attempt to save the old order led to an even stricter and more ideological control over the army. The culmination of events fell on the May days of 1918. The Petrograd Cheka announced the completion of the investigation into the White Guard conspiracy in the headquarters. The final clash of ideas occurred not on the battlefield, but in interrogation protocols and sentences. Ivan Dubovoy was sentenced to the highest measure of social protection, as the termination of life by tribunal decision was then officially called. The execution of the sentence took place in an atmosphere of strict secrecy to prevent possible unrest among officers still sympathetic to him. His death was not just the elimination of an enemy, it was a symbolic destruction of the very possibility of compromise between two eras. All streams of suspicion, hatred, and fear converged at one point, in the basement, where the earthly history of the general, who dared to play the most dangerous game of his life, ended. The shock experienced by Petrograd was not only due to the very fact of betrayal, but also to the realization of how deeply the threads of the conspiracy had penetrated. In those days, hundreds of people were taken into custody, many of whom had only an indirect connection to Dubovoy. The flywheel of repression, set in motion by this case, could no longer be stopped. For many officers who had honestly decided to serve the new government, Dubovoy's case became a personal tragedy. Now they had to prove their loyalty doubly, constantly feeling the cold gaze of the commissar. The trust that had only just begun to build was burned in the flames of this scandal. The officer corps of the Red Army became an object of special attention for the special services for many years to come. which ultimately led to even larger-scale purges in the future. The resonance of this story is felt even today, if one looks at it through the prism of universal human truths and political processes. The story of Ivan Dubovoy raises the question of the limits of what is permissible in the struggle for one's ideals. Can the homeland be saved through deception? Is a lie for salvation justified if it leads to even greater losses? His example shows that, in eras of great change, truth becomes the most scarce commodity, and human life is merely small change in a big ideological game. We see how the paranoia of power, once it receives real confirmation, turns into a self-sustaining mechanism that begins to devour both the righteous and the guilty. This lesson is relevant today. Suspicion and the search for internal enemies often cause more harm to the state than the conspirators themselves. The significance of the Dubovoy case for Russian history is difficult to overestimate. It laid the foundations of the system of control that defined the country's appearance for many decades. In this story, we see the clash of two conceptions of honor. For Dubovoy, honor lay in loyalty to his original duty. For his judges, it lay in loyalty to the revolution. This conflict has no unambiguous solution within the framework of human logic, as each side acted within its own system of coordinates. But it is precisely such paradoxes that make history alive, forcing us to constantly analyze the choices of people caught in the epicenter of historical cataclysms. The general's fate became a kind of warning that in a world where old rules are destroyed, new ones are created on the blood and ashes of illusions. Returning to the image of the man in the overcoat on the Neva embankment, we now see not just an officer, but a tragic figure caught between a hammer and an anvil. His path from recognition to oblivion took less than a year, but in this short period, the entire drama of the Russian Revolution was contained. He went down in history as a man whose transition to the enemy's side turned out to be merely a skillful facade, and whose exposure changed the rules of the game for thousands of his contemporaries. Petrograd of 1918 remained in memory as a city of great hopes and equally great fears, where every lamppost could become a witness to the ultimate truth. Concluding this narrative, it is worth remembering that history knows no subjunctive mood, but it always leaves us room for reflection. Ivan Dubovoy left behind not only a trace in the Cheka's archival folders, but also an important question about what remains of a person when all his masks are torn off. His end was predetermined by the logic of that merciless time, but his motives still cause controversy among historians. Was he a hero of resistance, or simply a man who failed to adapt to the new reality and chose the path of self-destruction through risk? Everyone finds the answer to this question for themselves, looking at the misty banks of the Neva, which have seen so many ups and downs. The cycle closed. The one who tried to deceive time became its victim, leaving us only the right to remember and analyze the lessons of the past, so as not to repeat its mistakes in the future. This story is not just a chronicle of one betrayal or one loyalty. It is a mirror reflecting the face of an era that knows no mercy. We see how the small decisions of individuals intertwine into a grand tapestry that determines the fates of millions. And in this tapestry, Ivan Dubovoy's thread, though prematurely severed, will forever remain a vivid and painful reminder of the price one sometimes has to pay for trying to stay true to oneself in a world that demands you become someone else. Ultimately, history is not just dates and facts. It is the pulsation of human hearts beating in unison or out of sync with the rhythm of time. And General Dubovoy's story is one of the loudest and most tragic confirmations of this truth. $350 million, approximately that amount in modern equivalent, could be estimated as the damage from the supply disruptions and sabotages indirectly linked to the underground activities during that period. But no figures can measure the level of lost trust and the paralyzing fear that settled in the headquarters. On December 21st of the same year, when the first snow finally covered the city streets, many had already forgotten Dubovoy's name, but the system he unwittingly helped to tighten was only beginning its long and bloody path. In the 17th century, similar conspiracies might have ended in exile, but the 20th century did not forgive mistakes. Approximately 40% of the officer corps of the Petrograd garrison, to varying degrees, underwent checks and repressions during the following year. These data, expressed in words, only emphasize the scale of the catastrophe that began with 1_0_ defection to the Reds. Ivan Dubovoy's world collapsed as swiftly as the entire empire he once served. But in this collapse, there was its own harsh logic. He tried to fight the system with its own methods, through conspiracy, infiltration, and disinformation. However, he underestimated that the new power, itself born in the underground, knew these rules far better than any career military officer. It was a duel between an amateur nobleman and professionals of the revolutionary cause. The outcome was obvious from the very beginning, but it is the courage with which he took this step that makes us, a century later, return to this topic again. Today, as we analyze events of 100 years ago, the figure of Dubovoy appears to us as a warning that in conditions of civil confrontation, there is, and cannot be, a safe place. The attempt to sit on two chairs or play a double game in conditions of total ideologicalization of society inevitably leads to collapse. His story teaches us that honesty with oneself is, perhaps, the only thing a person has left when everything else is taken away. And although his life ended tragically in one of the Cheka basements, his choice, however controversial it may have been, became part of that vast and complex puzzle we call the history of our fatherland. Looking into the darkness of the past, we try to discern answers to the questions of the present. Why do people take such risks? What makes them stake everything for an idea? The answers lie in the very nature of man, in his eternal striving for justice as he understands it. Ivan Dubovoy was a product of his time, complex, contradictory, and ruthless. His fate is a reminder that behind every great historical event stand living people with their fears, hopes, and fatal mistakes. And as long as we remember these people, history remains for us not a set of dry facts, but a living lesson that we continue to learn every day. At the end of our journey through the back streets of revolutionary Petrograd, we return to that very same feeling of cold and uncertainty with which it all began. The city continues to live. The Neva still carries its waters to the bay, and the shadows of the past still roam the embankments. The story of Ivan Dubovoy is just one of thousands of threads, but it is precisely this one that allows us to feel the sharpness of that time, when every breath could be the last and every step decisive. May this story serve as a reminder of the value of peace, trust, and human life, which can so easily become a victim in the fire of great changes.